right, everybody. Welcome to this week's Griscom stream. I'm broadcasting to you live from Austin, Texas, where we are enjoying our first cold front of the fall season. A nice, cool 90 degrees. I hope you are good wherever you are at. I'm looking forward to this conversation a lot because Occupy was a really instrumental moment in my life, specifically, joining the left. And, we didn't feel like dedicating a whole episode to it on the main show, but there's some thoughts I have about it that I think are worth sharing with all of y'all. I'd be really happy to hear, if anyone has any stories or reflections, throw those in the chat. For people who are new, these are much more casual, so I'm sort of, reacting to the chat. So appreciate super chats on YouTube, appreciate all chats on Twitch as well. I'll try to get to a lot of them today because, I don't know, Occupy is one of those things where people have a lot of different feelings about it. It was extremely influential and obviously something that we talked about, but there was also a lot of kind of structural pitfalls that came with it. Along with all of that, maybe I didn't set it up for it, but if we feel like it later, I do have a kind of rapid fire Bitcoin debunk prepared. Because almost immediately after Matt and I did, again, like literally an hour on Bitcoin, which we're going to do another, we have an interview on Wednesday, on Bitcoin, as well as someone who can talk a little bit more to the technical side of it. I'll tell you right now, though, for folks who are expecting Matt and I to sort of be taken to task, he's not a believer either. But, we did an hour on it on Wednesday, so maybe I might do some responses to this website that sort of has like counter arguments to debunk your friends who are Bitcoin skeptics and turn them into Bitcoin believers. And it's kind of as well thought out as you would expect, which means not very, very much. But thanks all of y'all. It seems like folks are here, so we can get started. I also noticed, I don't know what happened, I think Kowalski was early in here today too and hit us up with the chat, so I really appreciate that as well, brother. Want to make sure we are shouting out everybody. But yeah, let's get to it. We're 10 years out from Occupy, which is a pretty exceptional moment. Maybe I could talk a little bit about my experience with it to start, and again, feel free to jump into the throwing your memories and questions and things like that in the chat, because I think we might have a split audience in here. I know that some of our audience is a bit younger, so like you sort of knew Occupy when you maybe were still in high school or middle school as something that was going on, so you're more familiar with it on the other side. But I gotta say, when I first showed up to my Occupy camp in Washington, D.C., where I was living, I was a freshman in college, right when Occupy started. So it was sort of a trial by fire thing for me. I learned a lot really quickly. Like when I first showed up, and I showed up on the first day of Occupy, just sort of by chance, and people asked me to come by and check it out. There really was a lot of possibility in the air. And it was a kind of crash course in the left, but specifically the U.S. left. I remember we were sitting there. I was in Freedom Plaza. If people aren't familiar with D.C., you can get a pretty good view of the Capitol from there. And we were sitting there, and we were all giving the teachers from Madison, Wisconsin, a huge round of applause because they were there and they were the keynote speakers the first night. Primarily, like when I first started doing Occupy, at least when I started in DC, and some people can correct me if I'm wrong on this. There was Occupy Wall Street, which was supposed to sort of hit the financial center, the problem with the systems, that there's too much inequality in our society. Remember, like the big problem with Occupy is that it had a really confused critique of capitalism. So like it was talking about wealth inequality, but it was also very much like anti-consumerist and all these other kind of ideologies. But we'll get to that kind of stuff later. So the idea, at least in my early experience, was that you were going to have Occupy Wall Street, which is very much going to address the wealth and power in society that wasn't really distributed fairly, and then comparing that, in tandem with that, there was going to be what they were called Stop the Machine. which to my understanding was primarily organized by a lot of like anti-war veterans. So it was very much, talking about the war machine, American imperialism, and things like that. Um, and that was at least, at the beginning, like we weren't calling it Occupy that first night that we were camping out there. But later they opened up a second camp at McPherson Park in D.C. And they also held on the Freedom Plaza, and they basically had two camps. And then eventually it all just started to become understood as Occupy. And I'm just seeing here in the chat, I think there's a lot of different experiences of where you were when this was going on around the country. One of our comrades was working their ass off as a tech bro drone in Singapore when Occupy happened. That must have been interesting seeing it from the outside. Happened late into high school when I didn't really care about politics. Yeah, I mean, the thing for me is like I had just come up to school in Washington, D.C., and I was only a couple months in, so I was in that kind of like, doughy-eyed freshman in college moment, right, where I was just saying yes to most things. People were, checking out a lot of different things, and I just happened to go down to this huge political movement that again like had a really confused criticism of capitalism and of the system. But I really think that what ended up being influential for me was this kind of shift of having not even a structural critique, but just a critique that was a bit more radical. So I was there at the very beginning of the DC. I wasn't a leader or anything like that. I was just, fucking around. I had a banjo, and I was just like talking to people and learning as much as I could. Just being another one of the kind of bodies there. But it was a really interesting moment because there was a lot of feeling of possibility. Especially after, you see what's going on in New York, and it was really exciting. And then, that there's the DC iteration of it. And then you start seeing Occupy camps showing up all across the country, from like Athens, Georgia, Austin, Texas, obviously California got into it big time. And it was a really, really exciting moment. And there was this kind of belief, honestly, that this was going to spread around and become like the beginning of a new society. Now, I will say that was ridiculous of a conception. It certainly from the get-go was just filled with problems, and I'll get into those in a second. But I do want to talk about that kind of radical like hopefulness that did exist early on, and where that's something that we can try to like replicate, like maybe the feelings that are helpful, while sort of avoiding a lot of the politics that were extremely unhelpful. We have a lot of folks who are still students. I mean, this is the thing that's it's sort of. I mean, I was only a year into college at that point, so it's like very early in my life too. I think about it sometimes, just like if I had gone to college a year later or something like that, sort of missing out on that and wondering if I would have gotten the kind of political understanding that I ended up gaining from Occupy. I was only Charles Rantry says I was only slightly dumber during Occupy. That's good. Okay, well, let me see. Where should we go with this? Because like the thing is, like, there's been a week now of retellings, and I would be curious what y'all think about this, because one of the top things that I've been seeing, especially from the cool left, has been like this kind of universal line that Occupy was cringe. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. There was a lot of that like, I mean, I became a Marxist after dealing with the kind of utopian anarchism and hippie shit that was going on at Occupy. But I do think that it can be a little bit ahistorical, and I don't mean to be like, oh, well, if you weren't there, you shouldn't be able to talk about that. That's not what I mean at all. But I do think that especially people who were younger, people who weren't political at that time, they don't realize how much of a political wilderness the left was in. And the problem with Occupy is that it woke a lot of people. It really changed the game in, sort of injecting a kind of, it's not even a class critique, but an inequality critique into U.S. politics. It was really important at sort of opening up up those doors. And of course, there are aspects of it that were, sort of goofy and wild and utopian. But it has been interesting to sort of see how some people, I think, especially people who weren't participants in it, relate to it. And we have someone in the Twitch chat saying, I was at Occupy in my hometown. I mean, a lot of people, I think, were introduced to things. And I'm more curious, not to throw any shade toward, Occupy Wall Street in New York, but I'm more curious to hear what other people's experiences were at other Occupy, camps, because so much of the conversation, understandably so, is about Occupy Wall Street in particular. But really, I mean, the reason that it touched so many people is that it was touching a lot of different parts of the country. No doubt about it, a lot of the other places other than, major cities were primarily, college campuses. But yeah, I would be interested in hearing from all of y'all. But let me see. I'll look at some things in the chat here, and then, because I have a longer sort of point about Occupy, but I want to reminisce for a couple minutes. For all the progress of being capitalism's poster boy, this is a comparison to what was going on in Occupy. For all the progress of being capitalism's poster boy in Singapore, you can't protest in public at all without being accosted by police. Yeah. Even taking photos of public disasters was frowned upon by authorities. Lord, that's wild stuff. Arthur says, Occupy turned me off of anarchism. Now I'm more of a communist. Sounds good. I mean, that's pretty much was my experience with it as well. If Occupy didn't matter, Obama wouldn't have ordered DHS to crush it. I don't find that no lies detected there. I mean, it was brutally put down, specifically in D.C. And it's interesting when you're reading about what happened in Occupy Wall Street, right, is that it did get so brutally put down, but the DC occupation ended up lasting for a good while, as did other ones. And it was sort of interesting to see as it fizzled out in some places, sort of reigniting in others. And people might have seen last week, and we put it up as a clip today, a lot of different people took up the mantle of what Occupy was and what Occupy represented, including weird-ass groups like Occupy Democrats, right? So, we have to understand the kind of limitations of the success there. But I do think that, if anything, it was coming out of a period of like hopelessness for the left, of honestly, like not even having a structure. Doug Henwood had a really good piece in Jacobin where he was talking about how he had started a blog right before Occupy had started, called Why Bother, right? And he was writing it because at that point in his life, he was a radical, who was, wondering what the point of doing politics on the left was, because they were completely out of power. Nobody was listening to them. They weren't class rooted in any significant way, right? It was one of those things that's like, okay, well, can you, maybe just change the channel and just like understand things suck. But I mean, there was a real hopelessness amongst a lot of the left, and you saw people sort of attach themselves to like niche movements. And the reason that Occupy was different is because, again, even though it didn't have a proper like good Marxist or socialist class struggle critique of capitalism itself, it was at least injecting, a kind of concept of the many versus the few, right? That was completely missing from the U.S. politics in particular. Sounds like the shortcomings of Occupy Toronto were exactly the same as elsewhere. Utopian was with the Burning Man vibe. Nobody talks about their super exploited class, the domestic workers. I'm talking about in Singapore. Occupy moved a lot of folks, this is from Rachel, a lot of folks into wholeheartedly accepting communism of various tendencies. And, that, but also, people went into a whole bunch of different kind of directions, right? I mean, so let's get into some of the meat of this, right? I think the Occupying DC was a little bit different from a lot of other parts of the country, and also, of Canada, other places where similar movements, started to develop, just because of its location, being in DC, right? And it didn't become as famous as Wall Street. But there was a kind of, antagonism towards the state, right? And I think that was really helpful for a lot of people who were sort of coming into it, as pretty typical people who like might identify as left, and by that they mean Democrats, starting to see that these elected officials who they think are sort of on their side are very, very much against them. So we'd go and we're protesting, these huge dinners, fundraising dinners and things like that. And you would see these lobbyists come in just looking like, you know, like literal pigs, honestly, coming in and flicking everybody off. I mean, there was a real distinction between the protesters and who was being protested. And I don't know, maybe it's a juvenile observation, but at least for me, it was one of these realizations that this kind of conception of democracy that we have, right, of just all these different political perspectives sort of engaging in conflict in the halls of power, but we're all sort of living in the same kind of community, that it almost immediately evaporated, right? Because you realize that, like, no, these people don't give a shit about you. Like, I would be standing there with transit workers or with veterans who were really struggling financially, and also with getting their health care and things like that, and to just see the people, right, the lobbyists, but also congressional staffers, people who were running think tanks, things, that kind of class of people that is a huge part of DC. Seeing the disdain that they had for all of us, that was like jumping into a cold lake kind of moment, right? Like things slowed down and things started to become really clear. The problem was where to go next, right? There was a lack of direction, right? But it was a really crystallizing moment in sort of recognizing that these people don't give a shit about you. And then seeing them in different contexts, right? So like I remember we protested Lindsey Graham, right, who's a senator from South Carolina. And one of the members of the group of us with us was a veteran, and we went into like a fancy dinner that he was hosting, fundraising dinner, and one of the people was like, I'm a veteran, and I fought and I injured myself in combat. And I can't get this, the benefits I was promised. And Lindsey Graham like stopped the dinner and like specifically talked to that guy and gave him like somebody's phone number, and in the moment you're like, wow, that was like, we're getting some results. But then as I started to interact with people like Graham later, literally with Lindsey Graham later, you saw the attitude was constantly changing. He knew in that moment there were a lot of cameras around him, and he could sort of make this really great picture, which like, oh, I don't agree with what you're protesting, but if you're a veteran, I'm gonna help you out, right? And realizing more and more that this kind of shit is a game. Again, this is kind of like base level stuff. I'm bringing this up to show, like, even though there was a lot of lack in Occupy for me, and I don't think I'm unique in this, it was like a really, really quick education, at least who's on our side and who's not on our side. And there's limits to that kind of education, right? Because, there's plenty of people who are like, well, everybody's against me, right? Or this, that's kind of like typical, like not even anarchists in the philosophical tradition, like that kind of classic, like even Austin, fuck the system kind of person, right? Which is, all well and good, but that's not going to change the world, right? You have to have an understanding of what's going on and also what to do about it. And a lot of Americans, they become very, dissatisfied with the system. But the critique doesn't go anywhere, right? They just sort of plug out of politics, which is, a great advantage to our opponents. Let me see. There's some good stuff in the chat, so I want to make sure I'm not getting too behind on that. Why is it things like Occupy can generate such a strong message, yet we can't vote enough politicians in to accept its premise? Where's the disconnect between Occupy folks versus the rest of the voters? I'm going to get there later, Hugo, but I'll tell you, I mean, one of the biggest disasters of Occupy in DC was, especially early on, was this kind of fixation. I mean, everyone's like, Obama's going to come down to the camp and he's going to talk with us. The Democrats are going to come and absorb our platform into their, into the next election campaign, which is insane. And we would learn very soon after that no, the Democrats aren't coming, but the police are. We'll get to that kind of stuff, that larger stuff later. Prairie Fire, Kyle, thanks, bro. Wasn't very politically active during Occupy. I recall a conversation with my homeroom high school teacher, though. I said it was good because the bankers that caused the economy to collapse need to be punished. Yeah, and the sad thing though is they weren't in the end. Yeah, he agreed, but of course said the protesters went about it in the wrong way. Yeah. We need the agricultural report too, Kyle. We'll get that done soon. Um, the landlords in the area around Toronto's Occupy encampment were better organized against the occupiers than the occupiers themselves. It was a pretty ugly backlash and sad to see. Jeffrey, how long did the Occupy last in Toronto? I'd be curious to know. Comrade Tom from Yakubia says, I lived in Los Angeles during Occupy, and I remember criticism towards these folks who were intentionally unhoused when you had people sleeping in tents 4 blocks away long before and after Occupy. It's interesting. Let me see. Yeah, Obama just couldn't find his shoes. Well, I think Obama's response was a huge wake-up call to a lot of people, at least the people around me in D.C. I think, I mean, at that point, Obama was pretty much being understood as, if not a failure, as a huge disappointment. But yeah, let's talk about the structural stuff with Occupy. Because, it's funny now, being 10 years, some people were noting some things that Zizek was saying when he went to visit the folks at Occupy Wall Street. Saying like, don't let this be something where you say 10 years later, be like, oh, we were so young then and so hopeful and so beautiful. And wasn't it wonderful that we all got together? And it's ironic to see that that's pretty much what happened. I think that wouldn't be a fair total analysis, but there is a surface level truth to that. But I think to get to the real essence of what we can do with this, rather than just sort of reminiscing and laughing at funny things that we experienced, is this kind of line that Zizek also has, which was, what if you had a protest and everyone came, right? And that sort of is one of the political tensions of what Occupy ended up being, right? For so long on the U.S. left, and I would imagine very much similar with other folks in other countries, there's this kind of fixation, especially when we're in the political wilderness, with this, this idea that, the problem was that we're just not getting enough people to show up to our actions, right? And I think this is also a problem that some people on the socialist left too have, where they think that, like, if we just get the message out enough to people, then things are going to change. And we talk a lot about what I call, the depression that sort of exists on the working class, and I don't just mean that in a kind of psychological sense, but I mean like class confidence, right? Is low. Like, you talk to people all the time about policies that we like, or even socialism, as as in the full sense of the word, as a concept, and people were like, well, that sounds good, but that's not a real thing. And that's a real tension that we have, just in general. But like, Occupy really was the answer to that question: what happened if you held a protest and everyone came? And I'll say, like, again, in DC, like, we shut down the congressional offices and like forced people to have meetings. I sat across from what's her name, Virginia Fox, right, who was chair of the Education Committee, who was trying to cut Pell Grants, right? And we sat in the offices, and there was direction in those actions, but even still, like, we're still, that didn't change the game fundamentally. This idea of, like, basically like mass mobilization as an answer in and of itself is a huge problem, right? Because look, it's like we were able to win on the day, right? But where was the political movement a week later, right? It was constantly like the terrain. When you're doing mass mobilization politics, when you're doing like theatrical politics, and I'm just not thinking of a better word for that right now, but I'm, spectacle politics, right? Which is what occupations are, right? You're putting something physical for people to see, for people to have to interact with and consider, right? When you're doing that, the board resets constantly, right? Like, Occupy itself as a structure was a little bit more permanent, right? Because there were camps. But when I'm talking about things like occupying a congressional office to get certain demands met or have a certain kind of conversation, if there's not a structure on the other side of it that is able to build off of those kind of victories, we're just constantly going back, right? It's like you're going back into like the space of conflict, right? Which is like you're going in, you're breaking a rule, and daring the police to arrest you. And then you do it, and then you achieve your goal potentially. You have the meeting, you have the photo op that you want, and then you go back home, you go to sleep, and then you either go and do something similar the next day, or you go and take the day off because you've spent 12 hours at the congressional offices the next day. What I'm saying is like that kind of spectacle politics has a significant limit. And sometimes there's this kind of fetish, just like of if we have enough bodies, right, showing up to a protest, that will mean that things will fundamentally change. They won't. I mean, like, look at things like, I think, for example, you can look at like movements, like the mass movements that we saw in response to the killing of George Floyd, right? The continuation of Black Lives Matter protests as a moment where like having that many people showing up was extremely powerful and moved the dial in a lot of positive directions. It also built a lot of community, and we're seeing the benefits that have come out of all these years now of Black Lives Matter protests, right? But compare that to something, for example, like Women's March in response to Donald Trump getting elected. I mean, completely impotent in the sense of its political content, but you had a lot of bodies there, right? So it's just one of these kind of things, and especially for people who were like kind of insurrectionists in the sense like we're going to overthrow the state. It's one of those moments where you realize that like the idea that just like crowds in and of themselves as political action is severely limited, and that was one of the big problems with Occupy, is that there were significant limits to what was going to be on the other side of it. We remember the slogans, but there was a severe lack of political education, let alone the structural stuff, which we'll get into in a second. Jeffrey's saying Leo was interested in Occupy. I'm assuming you're saying Panish, but I might be wrong about that. Was interested in Occupy because of all the new people it brought to the leftist demonstrations after that. He was pretty enthusiastic about it. MDR says one of the disillusionments of Occupy spawned the hacktivist movement of Coney 2012. Again, wildly successful campaign, but no real material analysis or involvement of the labor movement. Tumble Wan says, we knocked on over 1 million doors in LA for Bernie and crushed a victory. Lots of us, people have since been subsumed into the superstructure. 50,000 people during BLM, nothing. I think there's, there's tensions, I think, with saying that BLM has delivered nothing. But let's talk about Occupy as like a left-wing structure and where it sort of leaves us today, because here's the thing, is that we're now post two things, and I think that some of us haven't wrestled with that enough. We're now post Occupy, right? That's not a structure that functionally exists. I know there's some like NGO type organizations that utilize the name, but functionally Occupy's over, right? 10 years now. And now we're post Bernie too. And I think that there are a lot of differences between those two moments, the people who were involved and how effective they were. But there also are some kind of fundamental similarities that I think we need to be wrestling with on the left. Let's start with Occupy then. So one of the things that's, early on in Occupy, it was this huge moment of political opportunity, political education in the sense of like, okay, here's like a whole different way of thinking about politics. Here's a whole different way of thinking about the state. As I was saying earlier, it's like realizing that American democracy doesn't function in the way that it's presented to you, becoming comfortable with terms like socialism. I mean, I was very much converted by these kind of, simple things that I would probably argue against using as our primary messages. But, these kind of things is like, oh, socialism is the fire department, et cetera, right? I think we need to be building stronger analysis than that. But there was a kind of demystification, or at least making these terms not feel scary or alien, that did happen for me during Occupy DC, at least. And I think that was extremely, extremely helpful, meeting communists and anarchists and stuff like that. Understanding these things for what they actually were saying ideologically, instead of like, American like kind of Red Scare stuff that were just sort of brought to fear or to think that they can't work, right? Because the point was that when the world felt so interrupted, and that was the kind of benefit of the spectacle of Occupy, things start to feel a little bit more possible. But effectively, what Occupy, at least in DC, started to become, it just became a huge mutual aid operation. And that, again, we've talked about mutual aid a lot on this show and on these streams in particular. I think mutual aid, I'm not one of these people who's against mutual aid, but severe political limits, right? We were out there and it was really helpful. We were helping people, right? And we had a lot of folks out there who could do good. And I don't think that that's a bad thing necessarily. But that basically became functionally what we were doing, right? It's like creating community for folks who lacked, community, and providing people with, medicine and food and friends and connections and things like that, right? And again, extremely beneficial. But at that point, the effectiveness of like the sloganeering of Occupy had already been permeated, I would argue, right? And DC in particular, I mean, DC stuck around for months after Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street had ended, and Occupy DC like really fizzled out because it did just become this kind of mutual aid operation, and it started to attract a certain kind of folk. It became extremely granola. But most importantly, the political content started to become robbed of it because anything to talk about dealing with saying like, okay, here are our political demands. Here are like, and like actual political demands, not just like get money out of politics, right? Like actual political demands in the sense of like, we want like robust investment in infrastructure and social spending. We want universal health care. We want these kind of things. That kind of talk was refused because it was alienating, right? Because we had to be catering towards like the insane, like Ron Paul libertarian folks, anarchists who just were sitting around, wanting to smash the state with no real plan of what that even would look like. And then some of us, socialists, and me, a little baby socialists with them, trying to say like, no, we can start to demand things and start to win them. We're going out there and basically doing these kind of huge spectacles every weekend, or during the week, and like confronting people in Congress. Why don't we confront them with legit plan? But there was a real refusal to do that. And look, people are well familiar with these critiques at this point. It was like a refusal structurally within the organization to have any kind of actual structure, consensus over all, right? Which is a disastrous way to run an organization, specifically an organization that didn't have proper membership, right? So basically the people who got to make decisions day in, day out were the people who showed up that day, right? Which could be very, very different from time to time, right? So without that kind of structure, things got really confused. But on top of it, a refusal to deal with any kind of conceptions of like organization, to even build some kind of like pre-party structure, for example. People talk. Somebody was asking earlier, like, why didn't the Occupy become like a political movement in that sense? It's like because structurally it refused to do that, because it was utopian in that sense. The real hope with Occupy, honestly, if you really cut it down, at least in my experience, was that they were just going to be occupations everywhere until that basically became, the new society. And functionally, it wasn't really working, to do that. I mean, like we had food and medicine and tents and things like that because people were going out. People who had money were donating it. People who were working were providing funds to do those kind of things, right? Do you know what I mean? Like it doesn't functionally work because you can't opt out of society in that sense, that a lot of people wanted it to be. Beyond that, I mean, there's just so much. I don't want to get lost, but beyond that, I mean, we all know like the problem with like the consensus stuff. The way we were meeting was terrible. I also started to see like how disastrous some of the kind of like moral posturing politics that we're really dealing with now. I started to see that show up. I mean, we had meetings with MTA, like the transport workers in DC, to potentially like aid us in, and working together to find common ground and to build something together. And it just almost immediately got derailed by a lot of like super, it was pre-woke in the sense of we weren't using that kind of terminology, but like, really kind of moral posturing about the way people's language was, like in the way workers were talking, things like that. That it was I didn't realize it at the time, but that was sort of a preview of what was going to be coming on the American left. So basically you have all of this pent up like failure of American of like American politics, right? That there was no avenue for anything different. There was no avenue to think creatively about politics. There was no avenue to think radically about politics, to challenge power, to challenge money, and things like that. And it became and that's what Occupy represented, was like, obviously it was planned out in some sense, but it really was an organic just cry of frustration without any kind of political avenue or direction, for politics, for most people in their daily life. The irony, right? So what I mean by that is, like, people in your daily life, you're a worker, you're a working class person, or you're a young person who doesn't think that you're going to have a lot of opportunity going forward. This was a moment where you could sort of, act on those frustrations by joining and showing up at the camps and protesting and participating in this experiment. Right. So it was something that actually came out of the material conditions that we were living in post financial crisis, post Obama failure. But the irony of that is, like, so, basically it's coming out of like the kind of feeling that there is no hope in politics, basically politics being suppressed for working people or people who had different visions. But the irony of that was that nobody had any kind of conception of how to engage in politics properly. So that's fundamentally why Occupy became what it was. Is because you had no political education. You had people who had never really thought like strategically about politics, like, okay, how do we do this and that? And you just had people out there with demands. And again, I think that this is a very valid thing. And this is why I sort of been pushing back against the, like, Occupy was cringe kind of retelling of it, because I think that that's incorrect. Occupy was a genuine kind of just reaction to a world that had felt that any kind of progressive political opportunities had been completely foreclosed. Right? The problem is that we hadn't been imagining or really strategizing on how to do anything different. There was a complete rejection of like socialism in the form of like a party structure to build power for working people. There was a complete rejection of class, right? Because primarily it was like consumerist. It was a soul kind of conversation, right? You are like a greedy guy who's a capitalist, right? Capitalist having very little to do with your relationship to production, and everything to do with like your personal aesthetics, right? Like how you look, how you talk, right? What you consume. And I think that was a real thing. So again, it's coming from a genuine place of, inequality and class warfare, and the class warfare being just like working class people being completely smashed at that point. But we didn't have our own terminology or ways of thinking about it, or at least those weren't popular within the movement. So again, it was an extremely valid moment, because the kind of realization that other people are frustrated, other people want something different, and other people are willing to, to try something new, right? Try something unorthodox, try something that feels radical. But, there was a limitation there, because we didn't have the structure within the movement itself. But also the movement, I think, completely surprised everybody just how many people also felt that way. Let me read some things from the chat, and then we can sort of get to where this takes us today. Because now, as I was saying earlier, we're post-Bernie now, right? So we're having another moment where we did something different there, but I think there also are, unfortunately, some similarities in the mistakes. Riley says utopian anarchism. Our demand was economic justice. Banks got bailed out. We got sold out. Yeah, but but then try to do something about it within politics, right? Making political demands, anything bigger than like we want money out of politics, things like that. It was functionally impossible, right? Because you had anarchists who thought that any kind of political demand, any kind of serious engagement, I guess, with the state or politics in that kind of more traditional way of viewing it as politics, that was foreclosed. That was not allowed, right? And we're doing consensus stuff, so we couldn't get anywhere. Charles says, I also remember those bankers drinking champagne in the windows of their office building. I mean, yeah, there was like very serious and clear examples of inequality. I mean, I remember standing outside the Chamber of Commerce, we were protesting them, and their staff comes out with like job applications, just like not to actually help people find something, but just to like kind of fuck you shit. Um, a service union donated a giant yurt to the encampment, and the Faculty of Education of the University of Toronto let the occupiers have meetings in their classroom. It was good to see their institutional support. I love it. Rachel says Occupy was not cringe at all, in my opinion. Yeah, not at all. I agree with Riley here. It's very empowering. Occupy was too trustworthy of the Democrats in Washington at the time. Some in Occupy believed Obama was going to help. Well, I don't know if you just joined us, Jared, but I was saying that was one of the funniest parts of early Occupy. Is all these people think that Obama was going to come because we were right by, the White House. He was going to show up and hang out with all of us. Yeah, let me see. Um, I don't have these up to share with you. I'm sorry, it's my mistake, and I can't do it right now. Um, or let me see, maybe I can, because there's a couple pieces. I think Doug Henwood's piece was really good on Occupy, um, and then there's also a really funny piece in the New Republic um, that was sort of breaking down uh, the what's it called? It was sort of breaking down the why they think that Occupy failed in D.C. And I think that this is an interesting, I don't know, point just because so much of the okay, let's see. I think I might be able to do this for you. I'll just give me one moment. Um, I mean, so many of the critiques that were coming from, typical liberals was like, oh, there weren't enough, demands, or there are too many demands. It's all over the place. And I do think one thing that was interesting about Occupy was that even though I think there's some truth, the thing is about Occupy is one of those things you can say almost anything about it and it'll be true in some form or another, right? Because, it touched on so much different shit. But I think one thing that actually was really helpful about Occupy was the shift, in the way that people were talking about political problems in a way that unites them. And I actually wanted to hold on one second. Let me just get this for you, because I think this is a good quote here. Okay, here it is. Why it's no surprise. Here we go. All right. I'm switching over now. Sorry for the delay. This is a piece in the New Republic written in January 30th, 2012. So a little bit out of, occupied DC. And, it's kind of like, oh, how dare these people think that they could do this in DC? We love politicians in DC. In DC, we're reformers. We don't share this kind of, negative belief in, being against the system. And maybe it's true about it might not being very popular on K Street, but Occupy DC did last for a very, very long period of time. But I wanted to note this because I think that this is the thing that Occupy was really helpful at developing in people that I think we can take advantage. So. They're talking about how it sort of failed to develop structures here, but they says in that way it's misleading to say that Occupy DC has failed. Indeed, it couldn't fail because it never had clear goals. Interesting. I mean, I think it was pretty clear, at least that it was against the gross inequalities in our society. Anyways, whenever we've strolled through the occupied park, the New Republic's office is only a couple blocks away from McPherson Square. We've exited more confused than we entered. Today, as they face possible eviction, protesters' signs and chants address TARP, Iraq, healthcare, foreclosures, student debt reliefs, tax reform, imperialism, capitalism, racism, sexism, genocide, and the camp's own possible disbandment. There were chants about the 99%, but there were also chants about Afghanistan. The only clear thread tying the DC protesters with the broader movement's concern about inequality was the fact that their group includes the word occupy. Now, in all of the things about Occupy, right? And again, we've been sort of talking about the issues with it and also why it was beneficial. This is the thing that I think is even beyond 99%. This is the thing that I think is probably one of the most important and long-lasting aspects of Occupy, something that we should celebrate. And I like this a lot because compare that to, like, this is New Republic. This is kind of typical lanyard wearing DC folks writing this piece, right? Saying like, oh, we went to the protest and we were really scared. We didn't really understand what was going on. They're talking about Afghanistan and imperialism, and also the fact that they don't have healthcare in this country, right? And for this kind of class of people, especially back then, there was this kind of way of trying to compartmentalize everything, right? So every issue was a new issue. And what Occupy was really good at, despite the fact that, like, yeah, it was sort of, there was sometimes feelings of a lack of direction, ideologically and politically attaching wealth inequality to American imperialism, to racism and sexism, to the history of this country, to the lack of healthcare that we have here, right? Tying all those things together has been extremely important in building class consciousness and building a left wing in this country post Occupy. And I like that piece a lot and highlighting that a lot because it shows, one, the kind of limits of the horizon of a lot of political liberalism, but two, how unique that seemed to political commentators at the time. And I think that sometimes you have to go back to reading those pieces, to understand what was added to the conversation. Because obviously people remember the 99% line, but it was this kind of thing of saying like, okay, well, we're dealing with all of these economic struggles in this country. I can't afford this. I can't afford that. That's also tied to American imperialism, right? The fact that so many people we were talking about the poverty trap a lot. That was when I first got introduced to that concept, right? Telling people it's like, working class people, poor people are encouraged to put themselves, into the military as a solution to all these problems that are created by capitalism, right? But functionally, that is just continuing to service that system, right? Connecting all of those kind of things was the kind of beginning of a materials analysis for me, and I think for a lot of people. And I think that was one of the things that was injected in the conversation, right? Because they are always like, well, Occupy introduced income inequality as a concept. And for sure it did, but what I think was really beneficial about it was actually tying all those different things together. And we had like the learnings and things like that, and the very, 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 the education we had there was very, very beneficial. But I think that when I talk about political education, like, it has to go further. Again, I don't think that I mean, who knows what would have happened, but like, I can say, just everyone's lives are different. And I think sometimes leaning too much on like your own personal like history, like what worked for you, what didn't, can be a mistake, right? Because, I don't know, we all turn out the way that we do. But for me, like Occupy, if it didn't, it primed me for becoming a Marxist. I was obviously introduced to those kind of concepts, but it took me a little while to come around completely to them. But it prepared me to thinking in a little bit of a different way. And I think specifically actually tying anti-war, like the thing is like the criticism of Occupy that it was like too many different things, right? Actually is absurd when you start to address what they mean by too many different things, right? Like, yeah, there was a lot of kind of like chicken with its head cut off aspects to Occupy, but the best aspects of it were the things that were connecting all of those different issues that people felt passionate about, to at least, if not, again, to like the proper Marxist analysis that we would have to develop later, at least starting to see that those things are connected. And I think that that's something that's really beneficial. And well, let me see. I want to get some stuff from the chat here, and then I wanted to sort of jump to today, so we can sort of see where I think there's some real beneficial lessons from Occupy, and where some things that it's probably good that we're doing different stuff now. Patrick Stevens, thanks so much, brother, says, finished Black Jacobins last night, and it was especially tough to do with the Haitian crisis. As Andre Domise said on TMBS, the West never forgave Haiti for independence. Would love if you had him on. I would absolutely love to have him on too, and you're 100% right. I mean, And also Pascal was making a similar point about, these horrific images that we're seeing on the border here of Texas, that, just because we might have a short historical memory, political memory, does not mean the ruling class does. And the ruling class never really forgave Haiti for injecting, that kind of idea of anti-slavery into our society, and we've been punishing them ever since. I think you're 100% right to connect those things. Definitely, the new Occupy is not as clear to who they are. Original Occupy put a very hard line, the 1%. The new Occupy is not as specific, which I find problematic. I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean by the new Occupy. Someone says, did blue collar unions join in? My foggy memory was mostly students and activists. To an extent, I mean, I think everyone's had different experiences. There's some pieces in Jacobin about the kind of up and down relationship that it had in New York, so I can't speak to that directly, but if you want to check out that piece, you can. I was saying earlier in DC, yeah, we had some union folks show up, mainly more rank and file. But I was saying I was getting previews of the inability of a kind of activist group of people to like really even engage properly with workers. There's a lot of like tone policing and shit like that, which is sort of funny. Like that was 2011, before that started to become a really big part of the U.S. left. Alejandro says, I almost became a trot. The trots ran the Marxist game in Occupy. Although I went to one PSL protest, which was pretty live. I mean, look, I'm not a member of the PSL. It's not my favorite org. I think a lot of their lines on things are bad, but especially in DC, I can't tell you another organization, or at least they're one of the better organizations when it comes to actually being class rooted, to organizing really intelligent protests. I mean, they're that's not a group of LARPers. I have some political disagreements, particularly on things. I don't feel the need to spend a lot of time, pumping up North Korea personally, for example. But I do think that, that's a really, really reputable organization. So I don't know where you were, but I will just say in my experience in DC, they were pretty good. Though I know, sometimes from the outside looking in, things can seem a little bit more coherent. So not to hedge my bets too much. Yeah, I wanted to. Oh shit. No, I think that's good. I wanted to note though some kind of things I've been revisiting. If people are looking for something to read after this, Matt and I did a whole episode on, I think almost, probably a year ago. Let me get the title here for y'all. If you're looking for something to read after this, maybe I would read a book called The Social Challenge Today. Syriza, Sanders, and Corbyn. And that was written by Leo Panich and Sam McKinden. And it's a really important book because it sort of looks at what happened, with the Corbyn movement, with Syriza, and also with the Sanders movement, and starts to try to develop a proper social strategy. Because I started this conversation about Occupy by noting that kind of funny irony about what Zizek was saying 10 years ago to folks was like, don't turn the 10-year anniversary of Occupy into something where you're sitting around saying like, we were so young then, it was so beautiful and so full of hope, etc. And there's been a lot of that kind of starry-eyed stuff. And I think Occupy is something you should lift your glass to and remember parts of it fondly, and know what things we need to develop further. But that being said, I think that, I don't want to just continue stumbling into some glorious moment to glorious moment. And what I mean by that is like all the ups and downs, for example, of both Bernie 16 and Bernie 2020, having a kind of similar danger of that kind of romantic loss. I don't want to just like every 10 years be celebrating something that we did 10 years ago. I want our people to be living in power. I want to, to break the power that capitalists have had over us, not just in this country, but everywhere, right? I want to be living in a different world. I want to be living in a successful socialist system. And, we got to just not fall into the trap of romanticizing things too much. So I highly suggest the book, The Social Challenge Today, because it starts to do those kind of criticisms. I want to just bring up a couple of things, to close here. that I think are really, really important for us, just to start to deal with, right? Because I think that we are in a similar moment post-Occupy, that we are in the post-Bernie situation. I think we're in a better position today than we were then, no doubt about it. But I do think that some of the kind of structural flaws of the Bernie movement, particularly him running the Democratic Party, we haven't really figured our way out of it. I mean, post Bernie right now, I mean, we have, membership in the DSA and things like that, but it's like an email list, a few different, Our Revolution groups, and they're all over the place. And I think a lot of them don't, I think while they might help out some local politicians, things like that, and it's great for fundraising, I don't think that that's the seeds that we need to be building socialism. So it's one of those things where it's like we have, in the same way that we had this mass mobilization during Occupy, we have this mass mobilization post Bernie, and we're all out there, but we haven't found a way to get that continuity and to also to do something different. And I think the way to start to do that is to maybe think structurally about this. I mean, Occupy wasn't prepared to make this demand, and I don't think that it had the intellectual roots that it would have even desired this necessarily. But I think while some people really were advocating for this in Occupy, both I know in DC and in New York, it didn't pan out, which was what some people were noting earlier, which was like, well, what was the relationship with labor? And it wasn't strong enough. There's no doubt about it, right? And somebody says, perhaps these cycles are part of long-term movement building. Absolutely, they're part of movement building. But the way that you build movements is by recognizing what they were and how to utilize them. And I think the tension that we have with Occupy is that everyone went home, right? So we opened up with the line here was like, what if you held a protest and everyone came? Well, what happened with Occupy is we had the protests and everyone came and we did a lot, and then everyone went home. And Bernie Sanders has some similarities there, where we had a lot of people who were for a few glorious months. We thought that something was going to break and we were going to maybe come into power. I mean, we were writing pretty ambitious pieces, and I think we have to be able to think big like that. I think one of the problems of some people who start saying like, oh, we need to think practically, I think that can be really dangerous. One, because I don't think the things we're advocating are impractical, but what they mean by thinking practically is like, well, what can we do in the next year, right? I think we need to be talking about how we would democratize finance. I think we need to have these ideas out there, because you never know when we're going to be in those moments, wherein having stronger political education and understanding of what our demands are will be extremely useful. And two, just because of the truth and the weight of capitalist realism and the difficulty that we are, you have to have that kind of radical and hopeful view toward the future. I mean, that's our territory. The conservatives own the past, right? But socialists and Marxists, communists, like we own the future. I mean, we always need to be thinking ahead in that way. But I digress. So the Bernie Sanders movement doesn't completely evaporate in the same way that Occupy seemed to go, right? I mean, Occupy didn't completely evaporate either, but remember like Michael White, who was, somebody who claimed later that they were the, co-founder of Occupy. I mean, they were doing like Google Glass fundraisers because they thought that if they could record enough stuff, it would change the game. Now they were at Davos recently, right? I mean, that's, a lot of the institutionalization of that movement was just, grifts, honestly. But the Bernie movement, it didn't completely evaporate, right? People went into the DSA. We have a media ecosystem that we did not have back then. But we need a lot more. And the bigger tension is both with Bernie and with Occupy was the relationship with the working class. I think that the Bernie Sanders movement was a lot better, not just with its relationship within, but its language around, the working class. It could have been a hell of a lot better. And I think one of the big tensions there was the fact that Bernie ran within the Democratic Party, which, that is something that I think people have become too comfortable with as a concept going forward. But beyond that, we have like those kind of structures, right? We have the email lists, etc. but we need to be doing much, much more. And then the biggest thing is that we use the phrasing that we use a lot, Matt and I, and we borrow from Sam and Leo Panich, which is class rooted rather than class focused. And what we got from Occupy and the Bernie Sanders movement was people who were very, very, they have a vocabulary now to talk about the interests of the people and the interests of the working class. And I think that that's really helpful. But that's focus versus rooted. And we need to be doing something much, much different. And you can't, and this is where a lot of people, I think, get into trouble in their thinking about this. Which is that you say, well, okay, well, the class isn't here. So either like you fall into like a kind of despair, and I've talked about this before, calling it a kind of like left pessimism, or you think that the problem is that the pitch is bad, right? Like the media strategy hasn't been strong enough. And I think that is another big mistake. The problem is that we can't do this kind of politics without the working class. And like what I mean by that is not to separate myself or yourself from the working class. And I think that's something that a lot of left commentators do, a lot of left writers do, and a lot of activists do. It's sort of like say like, well, if you're a leftist then you're outside of the working class. Well, what I'm saying is like you start doing that's self-defeating, right? But beyond this, like you have your relation as a member of the working class, right? But you aren't the working class itself, right? You're a part of it. And I think that socialists, like, you gotta think, maybe this is a better way to put it. The socialists are like the active part of the working class in politics, or at least they're the active portion trying to develop the conditions for working class transformation of society, right? Not to say that other people, members of the working class who are involved in politics, are not active, but socialist people who have this kind of historical analysis of themselves and those around them, they're the active members, right? And what we've been trying to do is, I don't know, sort of act without the base here. Because the thing is, I guess, is like you can't construct the base in the sense of we have to see where the practical struggles of working class politics are going. And that's why Bernie Sanders was so effective, because he was touching on a lot of these things, bread and butter issues that people are facing. But there was a fear of a kind of fundamental political break with like Democratic Party politics there, that I think was a severe limitation in sort of making that analysis and confidence and relation permanent. So where are we today? Like, we can't just do whatever. We can't just do whatever we want, right? Obviously. We can't just sit around and just make the most radical demands that we can think of. But we can create conditions and we can create consciousness that move the ball forward. So it's like, looking at where is class conflict going in this country right now? Where are there tensions? And there are a lot of very clear ones. Evictions, healthcare is still huge, wages. But I would go beyond just saying higher minimum wage, because while that's very galvanizing for a portion of the working class, there's a limitation there, right? Because it's people who are sort of on that cusp that it's the most present for them. And again, I'm not saying that advocating for a higher minimum wage is not a good thing. It absolutely is. But like starting to engage in like those like power struggles between bosses and workers too, as a major part of the movement. Like these are openings that we have to, one, be rooted in our communities, our working class communities, but to develop those struggles that are going on in front of us into political organization. Because the thing is, like, we just can't get everybody together again and to not have a political organization at the end of it. And, we're trying to build those in a lot of different groups and organizations right now. And, I think it's important to continue to develop those, right? And hopefully those will be the ones that capture that energy. But we just can't keep on coming together and fragmenting. And we're also leaving a hell of a lot of people outside of politics in that sense, right? So like, I do think that there is something to be said about if you are like a self-conscious like worker, if you are a socialist or a communist, right? Creating political space and demands to be taken up by the base is critical. And that's something that we have to be doing. We can't just be sitting around and waiting for them to happen themselves, right? We understand why imperialism is bad. We understand the way that your boss exploits you. We understand the engine of this system is built off of our labor, right? And what we need to do with that knowledge is to start to create those demands that open up political space, right, for us to build a more radical future, but also that can be taken up by the base itself, right, organically, in the sense that they're coming to these to these conclusions and these movements and these fights, right? So we can't just direct everything, like we're sitting in some kind of political control room, all the struggles of the working class. But we also can't just sit back either and say, well, I'm just going to wait for these kind of tensions to naturally come to the forefront, right? I think locating where they are and trying to build movements around that is really, really critical. And I think that that's something that if you're a socialist, you should be trying to engage in as much as you can in your community and organizations around you, specifically doing it, by the way, in ways that aren't just directing everybody in the final analysis, the final push there essentially being voting for the Democratic Party, because that shit is just not going to work. I'm not saying that maybe you can't be voting for certain candidates or things like that. I have no fucking fixation on some kind of like holy shit that some people have with the Democratic Party where it's like you can't touch it, you can't engage with it. I think that that's the incorrect analysis. It is the party of the bosses, it is the party of the bourgeoisie, but you can use it sometimes to help you. It can be beneficial. What I mean by that is that we can't be having all of our political energies just directing people towards the Democratic Party. And I think that that's been a tension that we haven't been able to find a way out of. The hope was with Bernie was that we were going to be able to build enough power then that we could control these levers and sort of and create tension and conflict between the Democratic Party and the working class, right? That was the gamble there. And that's, the one we took. And I think you have to take it where you get that kind of motivation. If you're a socialist, you have a once in a lifetime chance to do something. I think you have to. But I think that it's important not to draw the wrong lessons from it. Again, not having this kind of like neurotic fixation that I think some people who consider themselves to be on the left have with the Democratic Party as like, that's like the only and number one enemy. I think that that's absurd, right? Because that's just a form that our opponents take. And if you're a socialist or communist, you should understand that. But we need to be engaging in popular struggles as they are arising, finding ways to locate them and direct them, while also directing the energy and the organization into building independent working class organizations and institutions, right? And obviously that's the big ask, but I want to push back, I guess like on this kind of idea that it's just going to happen on its own, right? Which some people have. And this kind of idea that if you're a socialist, you just need to wait for something to happen. I think that that's absolutely wrong. Socialists throughout history, not just in the United States, but in any time there's been successful socialist movements, have been, yes, rooted in the working class, but they take up struggles and they articulate struggles and they make demands and people meet them there. And I think that that's a lesson that we really, really need to learn instead of just sitting around waiting for this kind of organic struggle, because this system is developed and designed to make struggle seem impractical or impossible for working people, and prevents people from having the kind of political imagination that is necessary to start to do something different, right? And if you have the ability, the time, and the education and all those kind of things to start envisioning those things, I think it's worthwhile to do and to start doing that kind of work of bringing these demands into the base, to trying to build an aware political movement. And the other thing that we have to deal with, and maybe this is a pin for later, um, is this. Um, we're going to have to try to figure out what we're going to do and what kind of relation we're going to have on the left with people who, because read a lot of, you can read people's pieces on Occupy, and a lot of people were saying at that moment, I had, I was involved in politics, and my plan was to work in an NGO, or like my plan was to, to get some kind of institutional job to try to push things in a certain direction, right? And people do that when they don't see base building politics as possible. Right? When you think that basically the only way you can change anything or to do anything is by going through the power structures, the structures as they stand, as they are constituted today, right? Right? If you want to change the world or influence the world, right, and you don't see that there's any avenue in base building politics and working class politics in that kind of bottom up way, you go to the institutions and you try to infiltrate them, or maybe not even infiltrate them in that kind of, having that kind of like connotation with it. You just try to join them and see what you can do, right? And you see people who are writing their reflections on Occupy. A lot of young people had that be a shift for them. Like, oh, I was just going to try to get involved in the, in the big organizations, but then I figured I'd become an activist, right? What people need to be able to, in our movement specifically in the U.S., and I don't think it's unique. I think similar thing exists, for example, in the United Kingdom. And I talked with Stella. Check that out on the victory of the victory in Unite the Union in the UK of a kind of more class rooted union movement than one that sort of focus on like the ups and downs of the Labour Party, right? These are the kind of developments that we're going to be seeing more and more, hopefully, right? Because those are positive developments. But we're also going to see the class of folks, and I'm not even trying to throw shade on them. It's just like people who want to get stuff done, you're going to see an institutional turn post Bernie. We're already seeing it with some of them, right? We tried the mass politics, we tried the populist politics, and they won't reject it, and they probably, and a lot of them are going, will consider themselves to be socialists, and I don't want to put that up to debate right now, whether or not they are. But what we're going to have to figure as a movement, right, in this post-Bernie moment, when we are sort of like on our back heels and trying to like find a way to return to the base, to get our demands to disseminate themselves into the working class, to start to build working class politics from the bottom up, we're going to have to figure out what we want to do and what our relation is going to be with people who are going to engage within the institutions, right? And I mean by that the NGOs, but I also mean by that people like AOC, right? Who I think is very much a part of these developments of the post Bernie and the post the 2016 and the post Occupy even. Finding what kind of relation we want to have with those movements, I think is going to be really, really critical, because we can't fall into the trap of social democracy. I don't think we even have the conditions for it currently, but we can't fall into that trap, and we need to figure out how we want to engage with these things in a way that's positive and is beneficial for working class people. It's not just burn everything. Are you pure? Or, are you true? Are you good? Are you evil? I think that shit needs to stop, because that just gets witch hunters and witches. That doesn't build a winning kind of politics. And there's too much of that on the left. I mean, I'm sort of rambling, so I might end it in a second, but there's so much on the left right now that is this kind of like, are you the good one? Or are you the bad one? Are you a apostate? Are you a true believer? And I don't think that's the way to build a movement. But I do think taking these questions seriously is, and I do think trying to engage with how we want to deal with this kind of post-Bernie moment is going to be the really critical fight that we have over the next couple of years. And, that's why I do what I do, to try to talk these things out with all of y'all and learn together and think these things through, because we are in a difficult moment, and I don't think that a retreat to the institutions is the way to go. I think finding our relationship to these things is going to be really, really critical. I want to make sure I'm not losing any chats from y'all. I appreciate the super chat from Charles. Twitch is a little quiet. Comrade Prayfire. Yeah, it's talking about institutions in Nebraska. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's that kind of stuff is fast. Kyle Kowalski Prairie Fire says, hence why I'm still a member of the GOP, because unless the Democrats plan to have a strategy for rural Nebraska, it's the only institution and there's no grassroots power. Yeah, I think finding ways to deal with these is going to be really interesting, and there's going to be unique answers across the country. People really ought to join organizations even when there isn't a pressing issue that everyone's caring about. Organizing after a crisis boils over and is not effective. Yeah, and it can oftentimes be too late, unfortunately. I haven't heard of this. Sorry, Mario. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I hope the points, especially about the last bit about institutions, is coming forward. But I think maybe the best way to handle that is to do some more in the future. Thanks everybody for hanging out. Tomorrow, Matt and I are going to do another interview on Bitcoin, talking a little bit more about the technical side, a few more other things. As always, feel free to reach out to me with any thoughts or questions, or just, whatever. Always happy to hear from you all. I'm thinking maybe I'll put up a poll on the Patreon or something. Y'all can sound off here too. I think maybe it might be good to go back to this Gendon Panich stuff that we were doing February seems so far away now, but, we were talking about political parties and things like that. It might be good to just go back into that and maybe to take these into more of a theoretical direction than like a news direction, these Griscom streams. It's sort of how I've been leaning lately, because I think this format is like really good for just sort of being able to touch on a lot of different things and not having to close everything off at the end. I like. But I was thinking about doing party stuff because I do think that that's still like the big question. But I've also been wanting to talk about like the Federal Reserve with y'all, if y'all are interested in that. Not more so of like understanding what that is and what the central bank's relationship to the state is. I think could be really beneficial because like since we've been doing this Bitcoin stuff, I mean, so much of like the left side of it is like a criticism of central banking and the Federal Reserve. And I think demystifying what that institution is, like, and maybe even just doing it like pure, like we're in a political science class without even doing any good social analysis, at least to start saying like, why did it develop? What does it consider itself to be? And then we can talk about what it really is. I don't know. That might be beneficial, but if that's sort of seems boring to folks, I won't put you through it. But I do think that could be really helpful. All right, y'all. Well, I will see you all tomorrow at 7 Central. And as always, take care.